Please give a warm welcome to the host of Broadway Buzz, Mr. Joe Gary.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, and welcome to Broadway Buzz, and welcome to Some Like It Hot. And let me tell you, the show sizzles. It's spectacular. The choreography, the costuming, the sets, the brilliant cast, the wonderful script, the show-stopping music, and all of it in the hands of Casey Nicola, who is the great director-choreographer. Casey is truly a Broadway baby. He spent his early years dancing in Broadway choruses, and then he became a very celebrated choreographer, and then he became a director choreographer, and he has given us a body of extraordinary works. Almost always his work focuses on the old-fashioned kind of style of Broadway musical comedy. But also under that, there is an underpinning that makes his works very contemporary and very immediate and very much of our time. So he's able to do both. He makes the old and the new come together in really an extraordinary way. He's given us such great works as The Drowsy Chaperone, Mean Girls, Prom, Aladdin. He's an extraordinary artist, and you're in for a great treat when you see the way he handles this show. Okay, but let us go back to the beginning. It all started in 1935 with a French film called Fanfare of Love. Now, I like to do a lot of very detailed research, so I immediately went, oh, I've got to find Fanfare of Love. Well, I spent 2 months, could never find it. I gave up in absolute disgust, saying, this is it, I can't do research anymore. I then realized there was a German version that was done in 1951. I was able to find that. And then I realized if I only started researching Billy Wilder, I wouldn't have had to go through all that agony, because Billy Wilder said in his early notes he couldn't find Fanfare of Love. So I felt much better about my research skills. And in any case, he did base his movies, Some Like It Hot, on that German film. It's a masterpiece. It's called the greatest comedy in movie history, and it deserves to be called that. It had an extraordinary cast. Tony Curtis, Jack Lemmon, Marilyn Monroe, all of them at the height of their powers, and most of all, Billy Wilder at the height of his power as a great comic interpreter on screen. If you haven't seen the film, I really urge you to try and see it. I talked to 2 gentlemen who came in before the show, and they both said to me, it's worth it for Maryland. And let me tell you, it is. Okay, so to go back to Billy Wilder, he uses ancient comic devices. And just for a moment, please bear with me. I want to go back and show you, where this source really is. It goes all the way back 2,500 years ago to the golden age of Greece and to the earliest form of comedy. Remember, Aristotle would write a seminal work in that period, and it was called the Poetics. And in it, he described komos, which meant comedy, and then he also described tragos, which meant tragedy. And what he taught us is that comedy requires a certain degree of detachment in order for us to laugh at something, whereas tragedy requires a certain degree of empathy so we will feel profoundly the experience we're having. One of the things he writes about so successfully in that treatise is that the line between comedy and tragedy is really very fine. And what you're going to find when you're in the middle of the second act of the show, you're going to be laughing, but then tears are going to be running down your face. The perfect example of what Aristophanes was talking about. Let me just look at one of the earliest Greek plays to show you some of the parallels. So we're looking at Aristophanes, who's called the father of Western comedy. And one of his early great works called The Birds. It was a story about two little men, Pythagoras and Euelpides. Let me just pause and tell you that this has been a formula we have used for comedy, since the dawn of comedy in the ancient Greek times. The idea of a buddy comedy, where two men are going through a series of conflicts, and the more complicated everything becomes, the funnier it becomes. And so that idea, is carried through with Bing Crosby and Bob Hope. It's carried through with Martin and Lewis, Abbott and Costello. That idea of the buddy comedy is an ancient form, and it's what we will see in this movie. But let me just go back a moment to Pythagoras and Euelpides. They decide to leave the earth because they said, politicians are too corrupt and you can buy judges. Does this sound familiar? In any case, they decide, maybe we better listen carefully to what they did. They decide that they're going to go and live with the gods, but then they discover the gods are as corrupt as man. And so what's left? They go and live in cloud cuckoo land with the birds. Maybe that's our future. So in any case, here we are. So everything in this kind of comedy that Aristophanes defined for us was that it's based on circumstance, coincidence, overstatement. One of the major forms of comedy, it's a low form of comedy called farce, which is based on the chase. And when you watch this musical, it is totally about a chase. Let me go to the film now and show you some examples of this. So Aristophanes lays out all these levels of humor for us. The more they try to solve a problem, the more complicated it becomes. Okay, so our two little men in this story, we have Joe and Jerry. The time is 1929. The place is Chicago. It's the beginning of Prohibition, and it's the beginning of the Depression. So this is a very complex and difficult time. And with the idea of all, liquor being sold now would be illegal, the only way you can do it is going through the speakeasies and using an illegal way. And we love the idea of, going behind the door so we could sip illegal alcohol and dance all the new dance rages and feel really wicked because we were breaking the law. Well, in any case, our two young men, Joe and Jerry, are musicians. Joe is a saxophone player. Jerry is a bass player. They are very deeply connected, therefore our buddy story. They auditioned for the mob because the mob controls all of the speakeasies. There are no legitimate nightclubs anymore, and the boys are finding it very difficult to survive. After they audition, they accidentally witness a mob execution. It is based on the St. Valentine's Day massacre. And it's enormously funny in the movie. Remember, going all the way back to Aristophanes again, violence treated in comedy with an exaggeration and a heightened effect can be very humorous. As you know, it was the basis of all our early movies. The Keystone Cops, the Three Stooges. We loved that kind of, the phrase was slapstick comedy. And so the two boys witness this and they realize, and the mob knows that they've seen it, so they have to go into deep hiding. They can't leave Chicago because the mob is looking for them at every bus station, train station, exit available. And so they're desperate to find a way to get out of Chicago. And then a coincidence happens. They learn by accident, keep in mind coincidence is a major form of comedy, they learn by accident that there's going to be a group of female musicians that are going to board a train from Chicago going to Miami, and that these ladies have been hired by Sweet Sue, and she's creating an all-girl band that she's taken to Florida. And lo and behold, they're missing a saxophone player and a bass player. And so, of course, the two men know that they have to apply for this, but it's an all-girl band, so they have to decide to wear drag. And so another major ancient element of humor, cross-dressing. I mean, we saw it in the myths and legends. We saw it in the early Greek comedies. They had little playlets that they called satyr plays, and these were very, very bawdy. They had very strong sexual reference. That's another major form of comedy, overt sexuality in some way. And so the end result is the boys have to cross-dress. Watch the brilliant scene in the musical. It's the third number of the show, and it's called Vamp. And we watch all of the frenzy. They're now being chased by the mob. So the frenzy of having them dress as women. And by the end of the number, we now have Joe becomes Josephine and Jerry becomes Geraldine. And of course, it's a visual sight gag. It's based on the ancient comic idea of incongruity, out of time, out of place, inappropriate. And so all of these things apply to our two men dressed this way. And of course, in the hands of Billy Wilder, this is enormously funny because remember, Tony Curtis, who plays Joe in the movie, he was one of the film idols of the day. I mean, he was the young stud of Hollywood at that point. And suddenly, to take this leading man, handsome young man, and put him in drag is very funny. And then, of course, Jack Lemmon was a great comic actor, and that works in an easier way. But there's a whole level of satire that sort of happens in the hands of Billy Wilder here. So our two heroes now go to this train station where they meet Sweet Sue. And Sweet Sue is the woman who's in charge of the band. She's a very tough cookie, and she scares them. And when she looks at Jerry, she says, "What's your name?" And he's terrified, and he says, "Daphne." Well, this comes from nowhere. And so now for the rest of the movie, he has to be Daphne, of course. And so she hires them. Just as they're ready to get on the train, they meet Sugar Kane, who is the singer in the group, and of course it's Marilyn Monroe. And when you see the movie, she's given the most spectacular entrance. No one has ever walked down the entrance to a train, to boarding the train, the way Marilyn does. I mean, everything moves, of course, and it's enormously funny. And what I want you to understand is that Joe is the worst skirt chaser in Chicago. So here is Joe, dressed in drag, pining over Marilyn Monroe, and that's what starts to happen. And then in the hands of Billy Wilder, we go to the sleeping car. So all of the overt sexuality, all of the heat really heats up when Sugar invites the boys who are dressed as girls to join her in her little sleeping compartment so that they could sip some illegal booze. And of course, it's enormously funny to watch. All right, so when they arrive in Florida, this is just an intro for you, but when they arrive in Florida, as they're walking into the lobby of the Del Coronado Hotel. Now keep in mind, this could only happen in Hollywood. Many of you know the great Del Coronado Hotel is in San Diego, but this is Hollywood, so they wanted to use that great hotel. It was close to the studio, and so they just placed it in Miami. Okay, so when he enters the Del Coronado Hotel, he meets then this old lecher, Osgood, who falls madly in love with Daphne. So now we're intensifying the chase. We have the mob chasing Joe and Jerry. We have Joe, Geraldine, chasing Sugar. We have Jerry, now dressed in drag, being pursued by Osgood. And so the whole story will develop in this way. It's an extraordinary visual farce. It uses every element of humor. I want to point to one other period in terms of the development of comedy. In the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, we had this movement in Italy. It was a street theater called the Commedia dell'arte. And it's very, very important. It was an improvisational theater, and so in order to make the improvisations work for the actors, they could fall back on a series of stock characters, meaning stereotypic characters, or stock situations, meaning certain things are always funny. And so they created a whole body of characters, young lovers who are thwarted. Keep in mind, years later, a century later, Shakespeare would borrow all of this. All of the brilliance of his comic characters really come from all of these early influences from the Commedia. And the same thing is true about Molière. When he was writing his great comedies, again, these stock characters and stock situations would all come from the Commedia dell'arte. And so, of course, Osgood in our movie is the dirty old man from the Commedia dell'arte. He was called Pantalone, and the idea was to always chase young girls. This becomes a very fine line now because we have very different sensitivities about that now than we did then. But in any case, these characters and these situations all come from the same thing. And in the Commedia, one of the standard ultimate forms to end a comedy would be a chase of some kind. So watch for that in the musical. At the end of the musical, there are so many storylines, so much has been going on, you wonder how are we ever going to resolve all of this? And they do it brilliantly in the musical by having a 5-minute and 16-second chase. There are so many slamming doors, everybody is coming in and out of the doors, they're doing all this dialogue that helps to solve the whole storyline for us. And it's the thing that would win Casey Nicholaw the Tony Award for the brilliance of the staging of that final number. So you're in for a great treat. I want to share another moment with you from the film, and I'm not giving anything away in the plot because this final scene in the film doesn't happen in the musical. The chase replaces it. But in the final scene in the musical, the gang finds the boys in Florida. There's a lot of shooting. The FBI is chasing the gang is chasing the boys are chasing Sugar. Osgood is chasing Daphne. Everyone is being chased in the movie. And at the very end, Osgood saves the day. And he has his motorboat waiting in the harbor, and he saves his beloved Daphne, and Joe and Sugar join them as they escape the mob and all the frenzy that's happening, and they're going to his yacht where they're all going to live happily ever after. Except, of course, there's this one problem. Daphne is, not who Osgood thinks Daphne is. And so in that final scene, Osgood says, "Will you marry me?" And poor Daphne says, "I smoke." And he says, "I don't care, will you marry me?" And Daphne says, "I drink." He says, "I don't care, please marry me." And Daphne says, "I can't have children." He says, "Doesn't matter, we'll adopt." So in that moment, Jack Lemmon rips off his wig and says, "I'm a man." And Osgood says, "Nobody's perfect." And that's the end of the movie. Now, I want to tell you, when Billy Wilder made this movie, he wrote the text, of course, and he hated the final line. And he said, well, we've got to film it, we've got to send it out to test it with audiences, so we'll change it, we'll dub something in, so we'll just send it the way it is. And of course, the audience adored it. I mean, it's the perfect line. It's become one of the greatest lines in movie history. And so the end result is, obviously, he never changed his idea. After the movie was such a tremendous success, everyone was begging for a sequel. And Billy Wilder said, I am too old and too rich to work with Marilyn Monroe again. Now, this is not to discredit Marilyn Monroe. She's brilliant in the movie. I mean, every frame, she's given several songs that are extraordinary, and no one can sing Poo-Poo-Padoop better than Marilyn Monroe, let me tell you. And it's really an astonishing movie. Just a couple of little backstories about Dear Marilyn in the film, not to discredit her brilliance. But Tony Curtis wrote in his biography that her first line was, "Hi, I'm Sugar." It took 46 takes because she kept saying sugar, hi, or she could never quite get it right. So, it was an endless process. The other thing was that during the making of the movie, Marilyn was pregnant. Sadly, after the movie, she lost the baby, but two things had to happen in the movie. You had to show as much of Marilyn as possible, number one, and then two, you had to hide as much as possible because she was already starting to show her pregnancy. Very interesting to go back and try and watch the movie knowing that little bit of information. But in any case, it is a groundbreaking film, and it is adored by everyone in the world. After the film was made, there were several play versions that were called Some Like It Hot. In one, for example, they cast Joe Namath, and he had just finished his athletic career, and this was one of his first debuts into theater, and it was a big success for him. And at the end of Tony Curtis's life, when he couldn't do any more movies, he was given the opportunity to do a stage version of Some Like It Hot on the West Coast, and he played Osgood this time. And he was enormously funny, and it was a very charming final stage performance for Tony Curtis. But I do want you to know that there was a 1971 musical version called Sugar. It was produced by David Merrick. If you're really a theater fan, by all means, listen to the album. The album is quite wonderful. It has wonderful stars in it. But the problem is, David Merrick was so insistent that he really wanted to create a clone of the movie. I mean, he kept saying, this is the funniest movie ever. Why wouldn't we use all of the lines? It's the funniest movie ever. Why wouldn't we copy all of the performances? So this was very difficult for the actors doing this on stage. As you know, from all of the musicals we've talked about, when we move from film to stage, the aim is not to be 100% accurate to the film. You try to catch the spirit of the film, certainly, but you have to turn it into, the obligation is not to just recreate the movie on stage. The aim is to create a brilliant musical. And so David Merrick was really hindering what could happen with the show. Walter Kerr, who was the major critic for the New York Times, wrote a Sunday think piece about it. When I grew up in the theater in that period, I read every think piece because it really was tremendously insightful and helped me to understand how the commercial theater really worked, because it was in the hands of writers, critics, who really knew the theater, who had written for the theater, who had directed for the theater, who had worked in the theater, and so therefore they had tremendous insight into what is wrong with the show or what is right with the show. So anyway, when I read Walter Kerr's article, the headline said, "The musical theater is dead." Well, I had just directed Jacques Brel. I was a young man who wanted to spend my career working in the musical theater, and this outraged me. In fact, it terrified me. So I wrote him, I got out my red ink and wrote him a very nasty note, and I wasn't satisfied with what I did, so I wrote him a second nasty note. Well, a year later, I invited him to come to Cleveland State. I was a young professor at the time, and I was in charge of the Speakers Bureau, and we hired Walter Kerr to come and talk about trends in the modern theater. And when I went to pick him up at the airport, he said, "Joe Gary, how do I know that name?" Well, we resolved all of that. I said, "I've written you so many fan notes." He said, "That's not what I'm thinking about." So he remembered. He had a very good memory. Okay, and luckily he was wrong. The musical theater did not die. And happily, our brilliant show, Some Like It Hot, was born. It took 7 years to birth the musical in the guiding hands of Casey Nicholaw. They work in collaboration now. So let me introduce then the Mark Shaman and Scott Whitman, who were the composer-lyricist. They gave us, their work. They did Hairspray, which is a spectacular score. They would do Smash, which was a television show with music, and incidentally, Smash is in workshop in New York for development for a production on Broadway in 2025. And the most exciting word of mouth from New York, from the business side, is that the score is spectacular and they've really have something very hot going for them, so we look forward to the opening of that. But they would also do Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and they have a long history of working in television. They worked very closely with Bette Midler on large numbers of things, and they write very commercial songs that are show-stopping songs. It is so wonderful when you go to see this show to say, at last, I'm coming back to see an old-fashioned musical with a strong storyline, with wonderful music. Listen carefully to how they open the show. I mean, it's a perfect opening number. It's sung by Sweet Sue, and she sets it up by letting you know it's 1929, times are tough, it's the Depression. It gives you everything you need to know in the opening number. The number is called What Are You Thirsty For? And what you discover, listen very carefully to the lyrics in the show. They're very much in the style of Cole Porter. They're very much in the style of Noel Coward. They're so lyric, they're so funny, they're so articulate. All these things are part of high comedy and the form of theater where we laugh at ideas or language, and that certainly happens in the music. But pay very careful attention to the final number of the first act called Some Like It Hot, a great number to end the act. Then the problem is always, how do you get that same momentum? Watch the opening of the second act. It's called Let's Be Bad, and with wonderful choreography. I want you to know that they extend the intermission a few minutes. I'm sure it's because they're giving the dancers oxygen. After you see the opening number of the show, you think, how are they going to top this? And then they do through the whole show. And the opening of the second act is such a spectacular number, the number itself, the humor of it, the language of it, and then, of course, the choreography, all spectacular. Okay, I especially want you to watch for a moment deep in the second act. Jerry sings a song as Daphne called You Could Blow Me Over with a Feather. It's a very, very powerful song. The actor who played it in New York won a Tony Award for this moment and this scene in the show. So watch for it carefully. It's what takes it out of just being an old-fashioned Broadway musical comedy and gives it a lot of contemporary essence. And what we start discovering is Jerry really starts feeling very comfortable being Daphne. And this is sort of, gender fluidity, words we use now. But listen to that brilliant song, and this is the moment where you laugh and cry. It's very touching in the show. And then the final number in the show, Prohibition, is over, and they sing a song called Let's Be Good. And it's as funny as Let's Be Bad was. And so in the hands of these great writers, they've given us an extraordinary score. Okay, I want to look for a few moments then at the brilliant book writer, Matthew Lopez. Some of you remember that just before the pandemic, he wrote a play called The Inheritance. It was a 7.5-hour play. It was either played with a matinee and evening, or it was played 2 evenings, simultaneous evenings. I was lucky enough, I was in New York just before the pandemic. I saw 10 shows, so talk about being contaminated. The last day, I saw The Inheritance. I came home, and the next day, all the theaters were closed, and the pandemic started. But I consoled myself in saying, well, you saw the greatest play of your lifetime in The Inheritance. It's a very powerful work. It's a redo of Brideshead Revisited, but wonderfully done with very strong contemporary issues. So Matthew Lopez is the perfect person, really, to sort of frame Some Like It Hot. And what he does, first thing, let me tell you the several things he does. Number one, he changes the time from 1929 to 1933. This is not a significant change. It's not the beginning of the stock market crash, and it's not the beginning of Prohibition. Rather, it will be the end of Prohibition, and it will be the beginning of improvement of our economy coming back. And so that's important. But what's much more important, why he made it in 1933, it places it right in the middle of the jazz age. So this opens the music to really being spectacular. Remember, in the 1920s, we had some musicals like No, No, Nanette and OK, but we didn't have a huge cavalcade of brilliant Broadway songs. But by the time we get to the 1930s, everything changes. And so now we're into the world of Duke Ellington and Count Basie, and we have the sounds, of Ella Fitzgerald, those rich, heavy sounds. Okay, so the other thing that he will do is to play the race card. So at the very beginning of the show, we see that Joe is white and Jerry is black. They audition for the mob. The mob says, we'll hire you, Joe, you're white. We won't hire you, Jerry, you're black. And the boys then sing a comic song that is called You Can't Have Me If You Don't Take Him. Very funny song. And of course, it's done with tap dancing and it's all over the top, but it deals with very strong social issue. Also, he makes Sweet Sue black. This is wonderful for the show. Some of you may remember in the 1930s, one of the most celebrated figures was Bricktop, who was an African-American who lived in Paris, who had red hair, Bricktop, and she opened a cabaret where she introduced jazz to all of Europe. So in a way, our Sweet Sue is now like Bricktop. And then they cast Sugar as black. Very smart choice. This opens the world of Lena Horne. It opens the world of Josephine Baker. And so now we can have all these great ballads in the show sung brilliantly by the black actress who plays the role. So the show comes together in a remarkable way. I hope that you're wearing fireproof clothes because the show is incendiary. Thank you.